Hello and welcome to another episode of the 1020 podcast. The following podcast is an audio recording of a Twitter space I did together with Elbridge, Colby, and Marko on geoeconomics. I hope that this is going to be the beginning of new content that I hope to create every week, including podcasts that will feature only myself, conversations with others, and on occasion, a debate format like this one with Mr. Colby and Mr. Marko. I hope you will enjoy it.
Now, without further ado, I want to turn to our Twitter space. I'm very happy that I have to introduce to you Elbridge Colby and Marko, both of whom I treasure highly as some of the best experts on issues geopolitics and geoeconomics. I got a couple of messages before this space saying, well, but they don't seem to agree on everything, and that's exactly the point. I wanted to have two very smart, very insightful commentators and observers of the current geopolitical scene who do not agree on everything, because I think this is going to be a great way for us to investigate and take a look at what's currently going on. Now, for the first round, this is going to be like a boxing match, or I think as they would have said in the 19th century, fisticuffs between two gentlemen. So for the first 5 minutes for each speaker, I kind of want to do a little bit of a reversed role. As those of you who follow Albert and Elbridge on Twitter, they know that Elbridge is more worried about the potential of the conflict between the US and China turning into a negative direction, whereas Albert is somewhat, I wouldn't say optimistic, but seems an escalation of the conflict less likely. So what I like to begin with is kind of to Elbridge take Albert's position and then Albert take Elbridge's position, meaning that Elbridge kind of will give us his most optimistic outlook and kind of what he sees as the most important factors that might postpone or maybe avoid a potential conflict between China and the US, and then have Albert come back and say, okay, what he sees as potentially the reasons why conflict could potentially become unavoidable. So without further ado, Elbridge, allow me to hand over the microphone to you and start your insights.
Well, great. Well, thanks, Ralph. It's a pleasure to be on with you and Albert. I appreciate the challenge. What I would say is I think the reasons for optimism, and I don't believe that conflict is inevitable, but the reasons for optimism, the most significant would be the fundamental difficulty of achieving, a cross-strait invasion and taking on the United States in what would likely become a regional war. So after all, Taiwan is an island 100 miles off the coast of China. Getting there and sustaining those operations would be incredibly demanding. It doesn't mean they're impossible. The U.S. has been neglectful and dilatory, but it has sort of begun to, or more than begun, it has shifted its focus more and more. So if you're China, I mean, the reason that I have for optimism is if you're Beijing, it is a cosmic roll of the dice to to launch an invasion and as part of that, a larger conflict with the United States. So that's sort of reason one. I also think the Chinese are sensitive to the economic implications. My sense is that if they decided to go, economic sanctions would have very limited impact and probably limited efficacy. But as they consider the ramifications and the sort of cost benefit, I think the unpredictability about it, the implications for China's economy and so forth, probably have a cautionary sort of pressure on Beijing. So those are probably the reasons that I would have for optimism.
Albert, what is your negative outlook on the current situation?
Well, thanks for having me on. Thanks, Elbridge for showing up and doing this with the time difference and whatnot. But for the Chinese, I think that for them to be able to launch an invasion into Taiwan, there needs to be certain factors that they've just been pushed into a corner, both economic and politically. The United States overplaying its USD weaponization against the Chinese, similar to what they're doing with the Russians. The United States also pushing the Indians to initiate any kind of cross-border conflict where the Chinese would feel like they're being just cornered in their own region of the world. I mean, you have, the Chinese, the entire Asian culture is a very face-saving culture. So for Xi to have any kind of embarrassment at the hands of the United States would probably force his hand in trying to take the trying to take Taiwan and adding another layer of defense from the Spratly Islands outwards. They certainly don't want the United States getting more of a footprint in the region like they already have in Japan and South Korea. So for those reasons alone, I think the Chinese would have to seriously consider a conflict with Taiwan and retaking it by force.
If you allow me to play devil's advocate for a second, I mean, one theory that is currently circulating is this idea that we are back in the time of great power conflict. And as China is catching up power, this increases the likelihood of war. Graham Allison talks about the Thucydides trap. But do you think it might be possible to say, if we look at factors like demography, volatility of the economic system, do you think it would be fair to say that maybe we're not necessarily look at great power conflict because powers are rising? Would it also be possible to say we look at great power conflict because in some areas powers are declining? So that maybe the Chinese say, right, they look at how their economies in some areas over-leveraged, they look at the demographic development, and then they look, let's say, at the US administration, and maybe, I'm not saying they do, but maybe they sense a certain weakness, right? Maybe it is similar to Putin, who looked at the US retreat from Afghanistan and says, okay, the US are in a position where they are perceived to be weak, so this is our chance to move. So it's not that it's powers on the rise that make conflict more likely, that potentially it's powers on the decline that could cause conflict to emerge. Elbridge, what do you think about this idea?
Honestly, I think this is more a discussion in the United States and the West than it is in China. I mean, talking to people who study China much more closely than I think there is very little sense in China that they are in decline. I mean, to the contrary. I mean, I think there's much more the East is rising kind of confidence. I think they are, obviously the demographic issue over a very long period of time is going to have an impact. Even if it's ahead of the UN projections or the formal projections, they have well over 1 billion people. There's a lot of people. So, I mean, I think the general cultural mood, as far as we can ascertain in China, is definitely not declinist. I mean, if anything, it's probably more, Imperial Germany style kind of chip on your shoulder, resentful than it is sort of we fear that, we're in decline. That's consistent, though, with being concerned. I mean, Xi Jinping has used language like strangled, like the Americans are trying to suppress China. So you can be, those two things go together. And in fact, if you go back to Imperial Germany, there was that phenomenon. Obviously, I don't want to take the analogy too far. But I also think some of the demographics and economic issues that really have to be seen in context. All of the East Asian countries are going through significant demographic decline, as is Europe in large swaths, as in parts of the United States. So, demographic decline is a relative factor, but it's something that's happening across the developed world. And I think we don't have to get into the sort of, distant metaphysics of whether China's in very long-term decline. I don't think that's something that they really seem to put a lot of stock into.
Albert, what do you think?
Well, I mean, this goes to the many arguments I've had on Twitter and elsewhere about multipolarity in the global power projection between the powers, which is only one power at the moment, which is the United States globally. I mean, other than that, I mean, you have regional powers like China in the South Asian seas. Russia was in the Central Asian sector, but other than that, it's there is no multipolarity, and I do agree that most of these discussions of the U.S. vacating areas, pulling out troops in Afghanistan and Iraq and whatnot is shown as a sign of weakness, and of course people are going to try to fill the gap, like the Turks have tried to fill the gap in Africa and the Middle East by aligning with Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Israel and Iran for some measures in Africa. So I mean, you have this dynamic where as the United States vacates areas, people come in. Everyone starts talking about multipolarity, and the the diplomatic crews go out there and start selling it to their leadership, and then their leadership tries to take as much land as they possibly can, like we saw with Russia. So there is that's my stance on that.
I mean, do you think, and here I can give a shout out to one of our listeners, Velina Chakarova is listening, and she recently published a very interesting paper on kind of the future of European security policy. And one argument that I find quite interesting is if you look at kind of just the statistical numbers, right? Population, economic power, the size of the militaries taken together, Europe could be a formidable both economic and military power, but it looks like that they lack the will to do so. So they might have the capacity, they might have the capabilities, but they might lack the will. Now, do you think that this element, I know it's a little bit metaphysical, but maybe you can entertain the idea for a second, that even the best military and the best economy might not suffice if you lack the willpower to use it in a geostrategic context. Albert, what do you think?
Yeah, the Europeans have multiple problems with that. I mean, the lack of will is one of the main ones because they still have this, embarrassment of colonialism in Africa that they're still, dealing with. But even besides that, I mean, for the Europeans to ramp up their military expenditures, I mean, you're talking about, tens of trillions of dollars, which they don't have at the moment. But they're caught in a doom loop. Like, if they want to get better trade deals globally, they have to have a military power projection. So they have a give and take here. But if they even start ramping those costs up, and what happens to the social programs? I mean, none of the politicians currently would ever dream of removing social programs from European governments, knowing that they'll most likely be voted out the next election.
Agreed, but just as a quick follow-up, but what we did see, just as a quick example, right? Germany spent almost $500 billion, a little bit less, only on energy in the year of 2022. All of Europe taken together, they spent about 1.2 trillion. So apparently when it comes to some areas, they are willing to spend money as much as they can. And a lot of this is also driven, $500 billion was spent over the last 20 years on the energy transition. So when it is ideologically opportune, or when they have the conviction it is necessary, it looks like that Europeans can spend a lot of money. But it seems that this idea never extends to the realm of the military, or to the realm of really becoming this global player that they want to be. What's your take on this, Elbridge?
Well, let me get back. I mean, I disagree with Albert that it's unipolar. Period. I mean, objectively, the by standard metrics, the Chinese economy is roughly the similar order of magnitude to the United States. There's some people who point out that some elements of Chinese economic power might be exaggerated, but by the same token, there are elements of American economic power that might be exaggerated. I mean, the United States is largely at this point a service economy. Chinese are the industrial workshop of the world. So from a kind of geopolitical point of view, there's some arguments that we're undercounting China's strength, especially when you use market exchange rates. And I mean, the Chinese are not purely a local power. They are building the world's largest navy, and they're increasing. I mean, if you look at their basing ambitions, as according to the U.S. Department of Defense and the U.S. intelligence community, they're throughout. I mean, they're throughout the South Pacific and the Indian Ocean, even into the South Atlantic. So I think that's the world we're. I mean, I think we just seen a recent example of their growing influence in the the arrangement with the Iranians. I mean, Europe. Look, latently, I mean, that's like, Germany was always like, wealthiest and most populous part of Europe for hundreds of years, but it wasn't able to translate that into cohesive power until the unification. So, I mean, Europe has a lot of, productive capacity. It has a lot of kind of latent military power, but it's very, very far from turning that into any kind of cohesive realities, particularly at the European level. And I mean, I think the behavior of the Federal Republic of Germany just makes that even more difficult, because that's the only country that could realistically, provide the muscle and kind of economic muscle and so forth to substantiate that. So, I mean, I think Europe is more likely to be a kind of local and more of a sort of area of geopolitical competition between, mostly concerned about itself. And this is one of the objections I have to the European powers, kind of the Brits, for instance, looking at this tilt towards the Indo-Pacific, and the United States placing a lot of weight on what Europe is kind of able and willing to do in the Western Pacific. I just don't think it's going to amount to much at the end of the day. It's not that it isn't desirable. It might very well be desirable from the U.S. point of view to some extent. Obviously, there's the legacy of colonialism and all that. But I just don't think it's a prudent bet.
I mean, if we would kind of, and then of course want Albert also to reply what you said about the comparison of unipolar and multipolar. But if we look at the European situation, I just want to press this point a last time, because I feel that there is a somewhat cultural dimension to the current geopolitical competition, and we currently see the French economy being paralyzed, including strikes at LNG ports, which are quite important at the moment, because they want to raise their retirement age from 62 to 64. And this brings me back to what Albert said about social programs. I mean, is it fair to say that not everyone, but a significant part in Western Europe at least, I think Eastern Europe is somewhat different there, but that they simply want to be left alone from global politics, that kind of they want kind of to go into this long sunset of aging populations with a strong welfare state, however that might be financed and however that might be sustainable, that would be a separate topic. And they really want to be left alone from all these international conflicts and international tensions, including to some extent what's happening in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine, so that it's less that Western Europe is either pro or pro-Ukraine or anti-Russian or the other way around, but it's simply that they're annoyed by it because it's a distraction, it's an annoyance from the what is seen as a larger issue, whether it's retirement age or welfare issues. And this then on the long term means that are the Europeans then going to be a net asset or a net drag on US capacities? Albert, and then please Elbridge.
That's quite the question here. The Europeans, the Europeans have so many problems right now, specifically concerning trade. For them to sit there and carry on by piggybacking on the United States economy by getting swaps is to me has just been childish and amateur hour for the entire past 40 years, 50 years. So I mean, we can sit there and discuss this blue in the face, but I mean, until the Europeans have a concrete discussion within their own European Union and who's going to lead this effort to militarize and actually push push for reforms, it's just a moot point in my position.
Elbridge?
Well, I mean, I tend to resist kind of explanations for state behavior that are too reliant on culture. I mean, obviously, there is something to the kind of end of history idea, and it's sort of a culturation, you're sort of a post-historical mindset. I mean, on the other hand, the French, for instance, at least the French state does not want to participate in that. I mean, and the Brits continue to at least have aspirations. I think the main thing is just the fact that the European, I mean, 50 years ago, certainly 100 years ago, the European states were by far the most powerful in the world, in the United States and Japan, and now that's not really the case. So there's just much more limited in what they can do. So I mean that I take your point. I might not put it quite so much on the sort of post-historical stuff as much of a problem as I think that is. But that leads me, Ralph, to kind of suggest that the European states should really focus on their kind of territorial defense in Europe and not sort of these kind of grand, we're going to go out and ride out and save the rules-based international order or wherever it's challenged, these kind of delusions.
No, I tend to agree with that. However, if they want to start solidifying their trade globally out into emerging markets, specifically Africa, they need to take the lead. They need to stop piggybacking on the U.S. and they need to take lead in Mali, Chad, Namibia, and all these other areas that Wagner and the Chinese have been encroaching on. I mean, even the Turks noticed this, and they've been doing the same thing. They've sent out their drones. They sent out their diplomatic corps. They've been pushing in Africa. Well, why aren't the Europeans doing this? I mean, this is...
No, I think Africa, you're right. I mean, that is Africa and the Near East are the most, and I guess Central Asia are the natural area. I mean, they're the neighboring areas for Europe. And I mean, there's clear direct interest. So, I mean, I agree with you that Africa is a natural area for Europe to focus its kind of power projection and, there's also migration, stabilization, terrorism, et cetera. So they haven't done a very good job on it necessarily. I mean, it's hard. We haven't done a great job on it either, but no, I agree with that point.
I mean, one of the big issues that is even making the headlines more and more, kind of two issues, if you want. One, of course, is the importance of microchips and semiconductors in the future, and the other one is who has the resources necessary to produce them. Now, particularly advanced semiconductors are mostly produced in Taiwan and South Korea, and I would like to ask you, how much do you think this could become a threat to the U.S. economy? And maybe as a broader question, maybe just shortly, one of you can walk us through how did it come, or how did it emerge that in such crucial areas, such a dependency on the Asian market, in this case, particularly Taiwan and South Korea, came together? And secondly, because we saw this in other areas as well, I think one of the things during the pandemic was that whether it was pharmaceutical products or whether it was protective equipment, a lot of this has been outsourced, in this case, to China, right? And I think it became really clear that this is a weakness. Maybe you can give us a little bit of a historical look at it, an assessment, and how you think that this might develop in the future. Kind of, who wants to go first?
I mean, I just talked about this, so it's fresh in my head, actually. I mean, this basically goes down to environmental policies between the United States and the U.S. I mean, to make semiconductors, to do the mining, to make the semiconductors, to do the active pharmaceutical ingredients on U.S. soil or European soil is cost prohibitive. There's so many regulations out there, and so many laws for the climate change and climate policies that it's just impossible for the United States to onshore all these things back home. It makes it cost prohibitive. The same thing for the Europeans. I mean, we can push it over to Mexico, but I don't even think that the Mexicans would really want all those dirty active pharmaceutical ingredients polluting their water and their airways at the moment. Nobody wants it, really. It's really down to India and China to do that, and I don't think that's going to change anytime in the near future, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's interesting you say that, Albert. I've had the same suspicion. I mean, Morris Chang's reaction to the CHIPS Act, which was a sort of scornful derision, was telling. Like, I don't think this is something that's just going to, I mean, it's a little bit like the defense industrial base. These things aren't going to be really materially addressed by relatively kind of small changes. They reflect much deeper decisions. I mean, look at rare earths, right? Like we could have a very large rare earth production and mining and so forth, as far as I understand. But it's a result of environmental decisions, probably labor decisions, et cetera, that are really deeply rooted. And I mean, also, a kind of working culture, that they have at like TSMC that I'm not sure that maybe, but I'm not sure that we could replicate in the United States. Someone like Matt Stoller says we can. He knows more about it than I do, but like, I do think, I think as a geopolitical sense, we, made a lot of decisions in the era after the Cold War. I mean, I think it's really important for us to distinguish the Cold War from the post-Cold War era. A lot of people like to talk about, we're leaving the post-war as in post-World War II, and that's wrong. I mean, the Cold War, our strategy was pretty good. I mean, we made some mistakes like in Vietnam, but we were pretty hard-nosed. We had an understanding of who our allies were, what the main threat was. Our economic policy was tied to our overall geopolitical policy. It reflected the relative strength of the American economy. Post-Cold War, we let sort of a kind of very ambitious, highfalutin liberalism, to go back to the end of history kind of idea, end of history approach, just kind of run roughshod. It was not like, well, the Western world, as in the NATO and the U.S. allies in the Asia world against the Soviet Union. It was like, we're going to cover the whole world. There was WTO. There was the opening to China. There was, responsible stakeholder. There was, we're going to democratize the Middle East. And I think that it's from that world where we got the idea that, like, letting a lot of our, in the 80s, as I understand it, we were quite concerned about this. There were actually, the Reagan administration actually, as I understand it, was actually trying to prevent the offshoring of a lot of the semiconductor industry. But after the Cold War, it was like, well, we're living in unipolarity. Nobody can challenge us. And there's always, my point about the opening to China, not the opening, but the post-Cold War economic opening to China was there was a twofold bet. Most people focus on the first one, which is that we would transform Chinese political culture and society into, liberal, whatever. But the secondary part, which was the more fundamental error, was that we would still outcompete the Chinese even if they cheated on WTO entry and all that kind of thing. And that one was the one that was that was really critical. And that's the one that said, well, it doesn't matter where semiconductors are produced because we live in Tom Friedman's world and it's perfectly efficient and nobody with a McDonald's fights each other. And now we're realizing, whoops, that was actually really incredibly wrong. And even Tom Friedman has abandoned that idea. But here we are.
Not only is it incredibly wrong, but it opened up a pathway for the Chinese and the Russians to use economic warfare as asymmetrical weapons against the United States. I mean, the Chinese can have phantom fines on U.S. companies over there, and the ramifications back home become political. So that's one of the things I always watch and tell clients is you got to look at what the Chinese want to do politically, which would affect the U.S. economy and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's definitely something we should definitely be looking at.
I mean, as you guys correctly pointed out, I think is that when the West or Europe was at the zenith of its power, 100, 150 years ago, a lot of this was because they dominated production. And one of the reasons why they dominated production was because of access to energy. And I think it's becoming clear now that energy really is one of the crucial elements of the future, as of course is access to minerals. And just a few examples, the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline. I think just today an oil project was approved by the Biden administration in Alaska. So it looks like that there might be some change in thinking. But we know, as Elbridge, as you mentioned, there would be rare earth reserves in the US. There would be lithium reserves in Maine. Sweden recently discovered a significant resources in the area of rare earths. So these resources probably would be there, but there seems to be an ideological barrier to exploiting them. So would it be fair to say, maybe not necessarily cultural, but one of the reasons why in this competition we sabotage, or Western nations sabotage themselves, is because it looks like that they still value certain ideological goals more than others, and that on the long run, could this become problematic? Or do you believe that, both of you, this question goes to both of you, or do you believe that at some point the collision with reality simply forces a change in attitude when it comes to mining, when it comes to refining, when it comes to drilling and exploration?
Well, I mean, maybe I'll jump in. I mean, yeah, don't get me wrong. I mean, you see it in the United States too. I mean, yes, this ideology does have an enormous impact on how much you're willing and able to, leverage your latent power for and capability for, to actually realize strength. And I mean, mining and energy production is a great example. I mean, you've seen with the Europeans burning coal at a higher rate this year that eventually at some point there's likely to be a correction, but it can a lot of bad things can happen. And in fact, especially with China, given how strong it is, irreversible or irremediable levels of damage can happen. But I mean, I think this kind of, I think the alternative view represented, von der Leyen was in Washington meeting with the president, is, quote unquote, we can work together, we can create this green energy, we can norm this, this will be the future, fossil fuels with the end of, will kind of go out the back door of history, et cetera. So I think that's their, and that's what's critical to the alternative mindset. I mean, they're not obtuse to these issues. But I think at some point, like, the reality is going to hit home.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's exactly right. I mean, once things stress the system, the policies that are in place, you'll see a lot of changes. Specifically, what the Germans had to do with energy prices skyrocketing. I mean, there's just sometimes the reality just kicks you in the face, and they have to do an about face turn and move another direction. And they're trying to do that and balance reality with political implications for the leading party at the moment. So that's, like I said, as soon as you stress the system, the reality hits, and all these policies will have to be readdressed.
One of the ideas that has also been circulated recently, and I'd be curious to get your take on this, is that there is this division. I know some of our listeners are from Hungary and from other Eastern European countries, and there seems to be this division a little bit in the attitude towards geopolitics in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe, and with some countries a little bit doing their very own thing. on the long run, on the medium to long run, do you think the United States should, I hesitate to use the term exploit because it has such a negative connotation, but there have been discussions that maybe in the future the US should focus more on cooperation with Poland and maybe when there is peace, kind of find ways to integrate Ukraine and then kind of to form an Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-American Eastern European kind of bloc and quote unquote more or less leave Western Europe to its own. Do you think that is a kind of a thing worthwhile entertaining, or do you think it's pure fiction? Because despite the military prowess that probably is higher in countries like Poland compared to Western Europe, the economic power of Western Europe for now is still higher than in Eastern Europe. So it's either going to be cooperation with all of Europe or / all of the EU or none of it? Or do you think that at some point there will be kind of a two-pronged approach how Washington deals with its European partners and European allies?
I think that the United States needs to push the Europeans for in the entirety. It needs to be the West and the East coordinating with for defense. It just can't be pushing the Eastern Europeans to do it, because of course Poland's going to ramp up their military as much as possible. The Albanians will do the same thing. Greece, so-so, but the Turks are always a little bit of a problem. But you got to put the European Union has to be pushed and forced into a position to where they have to take responsibility for their own defense. They cannot rely on the United States forever and have no defense, because at that point you become a vassal of the United States and you lose your geopolitical bargaining chips.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say a little bit different, I mean, is I think there's two options that the United States has. I mean, given that at least our stated policy, and I think it's the right one, I wish we were better at implementing, is that China's the priority. Europe remains very important, but it's a secondary theater compared to Asia. So the question is really like, ultimately, how can we work with Europe in alignment vis-a-vis China while protecting Europe from or helping Europe protect itself from Russian aggression, which obviously is both manifest but more limited than many of us feared in the past. I mean, I think that, as Albert rightly said, the Europeans need to take a much higher level of responsibility for their own defense, and that's just a counsel of prudence and practicality. Like we're not in a unipolar world anymore, so we've got to prioritize China, whether we like it or not, whether Biden likes it or not. It's going to happen. What I would say is, I think that, in a sense, and I wrote a piece about this in International Politik a few years ago, the German magazine, arguing in a sense that there could be a new transatlantic bargain where the United States could work with Europe, including the European Union, in a new way that was, in a sense, in my view, less sort of domineering U.S. role in Europe than had been the case certainly during the Cold War, but even during the post-Cold War period, in which the U.S. continued in this very kind of dominant mode. But the U.S. could be open to working with Europe in a sense, quote unquote, cohesive Europe, if Europe basically took more responsibility for its own defense and was broadly aligned on the China issue. It doesn't mean like agreed on every issue, but basically we're on the same side in terms of geoeconomics and that kind of thing, which is the problem with when Macron talks about the third pole. That undermines the whole logic of that argument. The problem is, if Europe's not going to do that, and particularly the leading European economies, Germany and France, have indicated that they're not, then, I mean, America's incentive shifts to working with countries within Europe, rather than Europe as a whole, but the countries within Europe that have aligned interest or are willing to work with the United States, basically on China, but also, more effectively vis-a-vis the Russian threat. I mean, to me, Poland should be, our top, sort of one of our genuinely top allies, certainly not only in Europe, but in the world. I mean, Poland is spending upwards towards 5% of GDP on defense. I mean, it's going above and beyond. I mean, Stoltenberg himself has said that 2% is basically now a floor, not a ceiling. Meanwhile, we're like lauding the Germans, and Biden gives Scholz, private visit in the White House a week and a half ago, when the Germans are completely wasted a year on the Zeitenwende. I mean, I'm not even sure they're actually going to do it, which is, I mean, shocking. But, and they're asking for a lot of, empathy and understanding when they, basically laughed at the Americans when they were warning them about the Nord Stream 2 issue and others, including the Poles. So I don't have a tremendous amount of sympathy on this point. And if we're not going to make any progress, we should work with countries, Italy, Poland, the United Kingdom, maybe France, maybe Finland, I don't know, who are going to take this problem more seriously and work with us in a more constructive way. And if that means going around Europe, then so be it.
Yeah, the problem becomes specifically for the Europeans acting against China with the U.S.'s favor is their economies are so tied to the Chinese market share at the moment that for them it's almost suicidal economically to sit there and kowtow the U.S. position in China. Which on top of that, the Chinese don't have a history of invading countries like the Russians do on the doorstep of Eastern Europe at the moment. So it's a hard sell for the Europeans. I agree with you. I think it's wrong. I think they do need to focus more on China because they are coming. They are gaining strength. Whether it's we disagree on whether it's regionally or not, but I mean, the Indians has a huge market share available for the Europeans. The African continent has a huge market share, and that the Europeans definitely need to step up.
Well, the Chinese definitely have history of invading other countries. If you ever go to like the Vietnamese War Museum in Hanoi, you can see it. They invaded Tibet. They invaded essentially China is actually itself a reflection of a successive. It was not a unified entity historically. They are preparing a military to invade Taiwan. They've actually attacked. They invaded parts of what the Indians consider their territory. They fought a territorial war with the Soviets back in the 1970s. They intervened in Korea. And the list goes on. Most of the reason they haven't been doing a lot of invading in the last couple hundred years is because they've been weak, which they're acutely aware of and seeking to rectify. But your first point, I completely agree with, which is that and this is the fundamental flaw in the Biden administration's Europe policy, but really its whole strategy, I think, which is really predicated on a kind of deal, as far as I can tell, with the Europeans that we will go whole hog for Ukraine, although we'll see. Politico detects cracks in that, which tells you that it's really happening because that's a friendly administration source. But basically that we will take the lead and we'll double down on Europe and all that kind of stuff and the NATO thing. And in exchange, the Europeans will be with us on China. And my point of view is the Europeans not only are not giving any signal that they're going to support us in the event of a conflict, but they're actually giving the reverse signal. Like Macron and Scholz said they're against decoupling. Scholz led a delegation. I mean, the chancellor of Germany, Europe's largest economy, led a delegation of major German businesses to China just a few months ago. So like what? And I mean, yeah, maybe they'd put some sanctions on in the event of conflict. But Albert, you're exactly right. I mean, the Germans in particular heavily dependent on exports to China. You can't. I mean, as the head of VW said, you can't replace that. So I actually don't think it's reasonable to ask the Europeans to declare economic warfare that would probably result in suicide. But the upshot of that is that we need a better military capability in the Western Pacific, which instead we're concentrating. We spent over $100 billion in Ukraine last year. I'm sympathetic to the Europeans. I think we should support them, but consistent with a genuine prioritization of the Western Pacific and Taiwan. And the Europeans should step up. And the way you would do that is you would actually put pressure on the Germans in particular. You would laud the Poles for doing what everybody should be doing, but we're basically kind of doing, I don't know if that's the reverse, but like we're elevating the Europeans, and we the Americans are sucking the oxygen out of the room by this sort of idea that the Americans are leading and doing everything, and we're literally giving the majority of the money and all this stuff, which we have continue to have elevated force levels in Europe, which doesn't even make sense because the official assessment of the Director of National Intelligence is that the Russian army has been worn down and has limited capability for the coming years against NATO. I mean, they're still a threat, but like if we think they're less of a threat, why do we have elevated force levels in EUCOM when people are saying Xi Jinping wants the ability to invade Taiwan by 2027? By the way, that has gone from being a kind of fringe view a couple of years ago to being the official assessment of the U.S. intelligence community. According to Bill Burns, the CIA director, he said Xi Jinping has given the PLA the order to be ready to successfully invade Taiwan by 2027. It doesn't mean he's going to do it, but it's like probably about as much warning as you're going to get in a competitive and dangerous world.
Yeah, it's funny you actually mentioned that. I was really, really against the Biden administration trying to cut the throats of the Russians after this war in Ukraine. Simply, I mean, only for the selfish interest of how do you justify military budgets in Europe with the United States military if there's no threat? If everyone views that the Russians are no longer a threat, you just can't justify the budgets. But like you said, we're ramping up the military in Russia, in Europe for the Russian threat. Meanwhile, the Chinese are gaining strength and putting militarized border with the Indians, which are in my view really good allies with the West, regardless of what people think about the Russian oil purchases and Russian S-300 purchases for defense materials. It's just that's completely should not be looked at in the same manner. But yes, I agree with you on that one.
I see that Greg Connolly from Sydney has joined us. So I think this is a very good point in time to a little bit make also the pivot to Southeast Asia that you gentlemen have already talked about. I mean, one of the things that came up as a consequence of the sanctions on Russia, I think very much to the disappointment of both Brussels as a representative capital of the EU and Washington, was that many countries in the world did not really follow suit. So that these sanctions are primarily Western sanctions, but they're not really sanctions by the global community or by the world. So it seems pretty clear that national interest is back, right? That this is really a concept that was somewhat of a dirty word, 2-3 years ago, but now it's kind of on everybody's lips who talks about geopolitics. Which leads to the question, do you think that diplomacy will play a more important role again? And why I'm asking this is because in the past, it seemed that both European politicians, but also American politicians, in their foreign policy, they could have the occasional gaffe or the occasional blunder, but the power structure was in a way that it didn't really matter. Now, if we look at, for example, the relationship between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the US administration, where it really seems that the Saudis are displeased with Biden, particularly when he said he wants to make Mohammed bin Salman an international pariah and these kind of things. And also with India, which is interested in having good relations with everyone, but of course also clearly pursues its own national interests. So do you think it is fair to say that in the future, we might need foreign policy staff, both in the US and Europe, that kind of relearns the art of diplomacy and is no longer just kind of paying lip service to whatever is the topic of the day? And I don't want to be too provocative here, but that sometimes maybe it is more important to be on good terms, let's say, for example, with Saudi Arabia, than, and again, I apologize, I don't want to be insensitive here, but maybe then to raise, the rainbow flag at the US embassy in Riyadh, that kind of, we have to be more, not sensitive, but more attuned to also the priorities and ideological and cultural characteristics of those countries who might not be our best friends, but whom we want to have aligned on our side when it comes to pursuing our own interests.
Well, I've spoken out against the State Department numerous times over the past few years, and even more loudly now. I think a lot of the problems that we have currently, whether it be Afghanistan, Albania, with some of the European countries and whatnot, stems from the State Department. They have in their foreign services test questions about abortion and gun rights and whatnot. And in my view, what they do is they try to weed out conservative people, specifically to maintain like the liberal view that aligns with the people that are in charge in the bureaucratic circles up in the State Department. And I think it's a really big problem. You have when the Trump administration was in power on the ground, however, the State Department officials were still pushing their own personal views with the Europeans, and it's a problem because the European diplomatic corps, they gather information from the State Department officials and they push it up the chain all the way to leadership, and that's how their foreign policy gets enacted. The problem is the United States, China, and Russia don't work like that. They actually work through the military attachés. Specifically, the United States goes through the Pentagon. You want real diplomacy, you go through the Pentagon. In the case of Saudi Arabia, when they have a problem, they don't call the State Department, they call the Pentagon to send over Apaches. That's just the reality of the situation. And when you upset that balance, you create chaos and division within your allies, and we have issues like we have now with the Saudis.
Elbridge, care to comment?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right in the sense that about the point that diplomacy will be increasingly important. And I think that's in a sense a function of, again, I go back to the structure of we're no longer in unipolarity. We are in a period that's more characterized by bipolarity with features of multipolarity is kind of how I put it. But, clearly the United States and China are by far the largest actors in the international system, and they're increasingly rivalrous, as you would expect. And that's very likely to continue as a structural reality. And in that context, a lot of players, and as you rightly put it, Ralph, Saudi Arabia is a classic example, are going to be trying to play both sides and see what they can get. The Emirates is another example. You see it clearly in ASEAN, in Latin America, in Africa, and to some extent even in Europe, where a number of countries are playing kind of footsie with the Chinese over various things. So in that context, I mean, in a way, our foreign policy over the last generation has become almost like a missionary work for like progressive liberalism in a lot of places. Sort of like, I mean, I don't want to say liberalism, but kind of progressive values and these kinds of things, and more of like an instructional kind of thing, like a sort of converting the heathen sort of idea. And instead of being like a diplomatic service in the sense that we want, I mean, obviously there are great people in the State Department and they're doing, great work and so forth. But on the whole, I think the idea that like, we're supposed to be out there working with countries that have options that are, calculating based on a power rather than sort of we're in a position to sort of dictate to them is something that's kind of foreign to our foreign policy on both sides. I mean, if you look at George W. Bush and Madeleine Albright, they weren't that far apart in a lot of ways. And so I think what we're going to need is, in a sense, a return to classical diplomacy, which is to say, trying to understand what the counterparty is looking for, what we can realistically give that's worth it for us in light of the competing offer in a sense. And I think that's become very real in the Middle East. And I think we'll see that more and more. And the other point is because a lot of that sort of missionary zealotry was backed by military force, in the sense that like if somebody didn't do what you want, you could threaten to bomb them. And that's not true anymore because we need to husband our military power in order to face off on the primary competitor. And that's going to be a different world than people are used to.
Yeah, I agree with the diplomatic stance, but I still disagree with you on the the multipolar or bipolar atmosphere of what we're in right now. So let's take a look at the Saudi Arabians at the moment. The only reason that the Saudi Arabians and the Iranians got together is because to appease China, which is their biggest oil client at the moment. They're both competing for market share, as are the Russians. But the moment that there's going to be a conflict with the Houthis or name your proxy group against the Saudis, they're not going to run to China. They're going to run to the United States because the United States is the only military that has the capability to defend our allies. The Chinese can't even go across the world to do anything. So for me, when you talk about multipolarity, I start looking at assessments of, what can the Chinese realistically do outside of their immediate borders? And for me, it's almost absolutely nothing. Zilch.
I mean, Albert, I got to tell you, like, you say that, but I mean, one, like the economic, you could question the economic data, but the macroeconomic data that we have available to us suggests that China is, if not a larger economy according to purchase power parity, is at least in the same ballpark. And I'll tell you that your sanguinity is not shared by the U.S. military establishment. I mean, and you don't have to take it from me. Look at what they're saying. I mean, the recently retired head of U.S. Strategic Command said the ship of American military conventional superiority over China is slowly sinking, or words to that effect. You might say they're wrong or they're exaggerating or whatever, but I mean, they're going to have 5 or 6 aircraft carriers by the end of the decade. They are outbuilding a huge space architecture. They are building nuclear-powered submarines. Their shipbuilding industry. So we have 4 naval shipyards. They have 13. One of theirs is larger than all of ours combined. They have a larger Navy than we do. Yes, we have larger tonnage, but they have the advantage of supply. You can see look at the Wall Street Journal in the last week. There was a very important article by Michael Gordon about how significant the challenges to our military superiority are. And look at the article on the South China Sea. I mean, they have militarized these. I mean, one of those islands is actually larger, at least in outline, than the District of Columbia. So, I mean, I understand that's your view. That's not the view of the U.S. defense establishment. I mean, and this is the Biden administration, by the way. This is not like, hard-nosed types or whatever. But like they're saying China is the only country that can challenge the U.S. globally and so forth. And the statement is that they want to have these. I mean, they were looking to build a base in Equatorial Guinea, which is on the Atlantic coast. Now, can they do it right now? No, but we're thinking about 5, 10, 15 years. That's what they're looking at, maybe even 20. But if countries like Saudi Arabia are calculating in Iran, no, Saudi Arabia is not going to completely go into the Iranian or the Chinese camp. Of course, they're going to try to, and they have a long legacy relationship with us. But it's very significant that they are looking to the Chinese. And I think that's a real indictment of U.S. statecraft. I mean, most countries, for instance, the Indians, who I think are critical partners of ours, and I have a lot of respect for, they have a very healthy regard for the Chinese. Like they do not take them lightly. And I mean, if you look at the differential growth rates between the Chinese and the Indian economies over the last 20, 25 years, it's not a source of sanguinity. I mean, the Indians continue to grow, but they're not so much above the rate of population growth. So, I mean, this is kind of the view that's shared, I think, across the official, and kind of Washington or whatever. And you could say that that's wrong, blah 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 blah. But I mean, I think it's, if you look at the facts, if you look at what's out there in metal and how the Chinese are practicing. I mean, there was an article today in one of the Air Force publications that U.S. air flying hours that are historic low. I mean, there's some sources that suggest the Chinese may be doing more of that stuff than we are. So that's the world we're moving into, and the idea that we're in the unipolar world, I just don't think holds up.
Well, I mean, we can look at their carriers. Their carriers are old ski slope designs. They're one newer carrier. Their catapult system doesn't work. The ski slope design automatically gives the United States a far better advantage with the fighter jets in that respect. They have almost no nuclear subs. The subs that they do have currently right now are absolutely so loud that you might as well play AC/DC on the intercom while you're trying to hunt somebody. They have their conscripts. Their conscript army has a high turnover rate. They don't serve for a very long time, and if things don't go to plan, they don't really have they don't have the coordination for something that goes off script for them. That they for me, I'm looking at all these things and I'm just like, how can the Chinese military, or specifically their Navy, compete with the United States? Let's just say in Equatorial Guinea, which I'm actually friends with the with the king, so with the dictator's son, but went to school with him. But I mean, how if the United States wanted to put choke points globally, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Horn of Africa, what could the Chinese military possibly do? In my respect, absolutely nothing. They get blown right out of the water.
Right now they couldn't, but they're building a Navy. I mean, Equatorial Guinea is at the ragged edge of their, right? I mean, they have established almost essentially effective operational control of the South China Sea. So ASEAN is far more important than like Southern Africa, right? Like in terms of the economic weight. So they're building outward from there. I mean, we can see where they're going. And I mean, again, they're building their submarines are improving. They don't need ballistic missile submarines. They've already got, according to an open congressional notification by U.S. Strategic Command, they have more ICBM silos than the United States does now, right? They use road mobile and ICBM. They're building a triad, which is a surprise to us. Their carriers are improving. Again, they've pushed our carriers back, right? I mean, the notion that carriers are useless is wrong. Our carriers are useless. But on the other hand, you're not going to send, it ain't 1995, 1996. We ain't sending those carriers anywhere near China in the event of a conflict. In fact, they're going to be going the other way to survive. So they've got a way that they're building out this plan that doesn't exactly mimic ours because they're in a different military and sort of geographic situation. But they definitely, I mean, our military people take them very seriously.
Oh, there's no question that should take it seriously. And I want to make it clear that I'm not suggesting that we just ignore China's threat for over the long term, but I don't see China as a military threat to the United States for the next 10 or 20 years. 50 years, 75 years, different story. They're absolutely trying to gear up for that. But we also have to keep in mind that the entire Chinese economy is handcuffed by the U.S. dollar. Without the U.S. dollar, their economy absolutely implodes. Their yuan goes into hyperinflation, and there is no China to speak of, and there's no military expenditures that they can actually enact. That's a weapon that the United States enjoys, being the reserve currency. Assure that, I think the military has been talking. Michael Cowell was talking about it, wrote a paper at West Point. So, but that's another aspect.
Yeah, but if we do that, it's mutual assured destruction. They can blow up our economy too. Imagine if they cut off exports. I mean, our trade with them has gone up, and they hold tons of treasuries. So, it's a mutual. I mean,
they can't. They can't sell the treasuries without employees. You're exactly right.
It's mutual assured destruction. So we're neither of us going to. So it's going to come down to who wins the local fight, and that's the problem. And I mean, you say that, but the official assessment of a Democratic appointee intelligence community is that Xi Jinping has given the PLA 2027, and as Admiral Gilday, the CNO, the Chief of Naval Operations, points out, they tend to exceed their timelines. So, I mean, I hear you say that, but I just if you look at what they're doing, it's extremely worrying.
Oh, we should be worried. There's no question we should be worried. I'm just standing on the table here saying, if the Chinese do this, the economic ramifications would be so devastating to Xi that he probably wouldn't even survive a week there. So this is another thing that I'm just like, it's not a clear-cut case that they're going to invade Taiwan. Listen, of course we got to watch it. There's no question we have to watch it. We have to be very nervous because if they do take Taiwan, it's a big black eye to the United States. It hurts. It hurts our tech sector tremendously. So we do have to worry about it. But in my view, I don't think that 2027 is a realistic date that they can actually take Taiwan. Specifically, looking at what happened to Russia, and the PLA has to be looking at that, saying if the United States interjects here, and we get decimated, what happens then?
I mean, this allows a little bit to come full circle a little bit. And when I listen to the way you two debated this, but isn't that in itself a significant risk? Like as Elbridge said, it's mutually assured destruction. So it's a matter of how do I estimate kind of my own side and how do I estimate the other side? And do I believe that in this potential mutually assured destruction, which side has the longer breath? Who has, quote unquote, the willpower to endure such a conflict? And do you think, and the question again goes to both of you, is it possible that the Chinese, that kind of everything Albert says is right, and also Albert say everything that Albert says is right, but that maybe, for example, the Chinese, that they assume, I mean, I'm spitballing here, this is pure conjecture, of course, but that they say that they assume that the US are internally weak, they are culturally weak. If China cuts off exports, if I'm now being facetious a little bit for dramatic effect, but if Americans and Europeans, right, if we don't get the iPhone in the store, and of course even worse things, medical equipment, protective gear, all these kind of things, that very soon public opinion will kind of turn against the conflict with China. That's similarly to what we have seen, at least in some European countries, with Ukraine, right? That people say, well, why should I care about Taiwan? Right? Why should I care about this? I want my, trinkets that are assembled in China, and if they expand in Southeast Asia, why not? Again, I say it a little bit provocatively, but isn't that maybe potentially a risk that the Chinese in some area are willing to take, because they say, yeah, this is going to be painful for us, but we can endure the pain longer than others. And I know a point, maybe Albert, that you can speak a little bit on, because you made this in the past very often, which is quite crucial, is that, of course, China is strongly depending on food imports. And I think one argument you made in the past is that if food becomes a problem in China, that Xi's basically toast. But just as, again, a playing devil's advocate, but we know there have been Chinese rulers in the past who politically did survive famines. So can we be sure that in such a conflict, not maybe the Chinese are going to hurt, but that they are more willing to take the pain compared to us?
Well, they didn't have the middle class that they do today is the problem. There's been plenty of lifting of the Chinese people in the middle class that they're accustomed to certain things and won't want to see going backwards at the moment. I mean, if the Chinese decide to go take Taiwan, without question, those ports will be off limits for shipping for unknown set of time, depending on what the scenario is. I mean, it could be 3 months, it could be 6 months, it could be a year. Nobody knows. It's just too much of a risk for the Chinese to have no imports of food and energy for that amount of time. It would risk complete economic destruction of China, and I just for that alone, I would say that it's just too risky.
Well, but I mean, the sanctions haven't even worked on Russia. The notion that you're going to get stronger sanctions on China when there's so much money to be made, and there's obviously so many countries that are going to be willing to participate. Now, I mean, there's a couple of things here, right? One is that the reason that I'm not fatalistic about this is I think that war is not inevitable, that it's not inevitable that the Chinese will attack, because there are great risks, mostly having to do with projecting force across the strait. So we're talking in kind of general terms, but like the main issue is going to be how successful they think they are going to be, in my view, in the attack. Because if this is a very, very different, I mean, we're talking about Ukraine. The reason Ukraine survived is not the sanctions, is not the West. I mean, there's the weapons and monetary support, but it's basically the Ukrainians' own resistance and the failure of the Russian military. So clearly, Xi Jinping is going to take from that, I want to be really sure that my attack is going to be as successful as it possibly can. But if it's going to be a very different situation if the Chinese attack and after 48 hours, Taiwan has basically capitulated. Right. Then people are going to say, look, I'm not going to commit economic suicide. Even in the United States, I don't think there's going to be there are going to be a lot of voices in the United States that are going to say, look, it's a fait accompli. Like, we'd be crazy. What can we do about it? Right. And like, I mean, why haven't, I was going back and forth, this guy who was in the Trump administration was like, well, the reason that we haven't succeeded with the Russians is because we haven't put on the sanctions that we put on Venezuela and Iran. It's like, well, yeah, right. Because probably there's a reason, right? I'm not saying it's like necessarily a good reason or not, but there are going to be huge structural constraints and interests. Like, obviously the Russians are going to sell the Chinese food. I mean, there's going to be a huge price premium on oil. I mean, I assume the Iranians are going to sell them food or oil. I assume the Gulf states would probably sell them food because the price is going to be very, very high. And the Chinese are going to contest our ability to sustain that blockade. I mean, obviously a blockade is something that net is in our advantage. Our Navy's actually not really structured to conduct a distant blockade at this point. It's really it's structured more for power projection and to some extent sea control. But that's that's not how the conflict is going to go, I think. But I mean, I think it's a deterrent to shoot. I mean, the right way to look at this, I think, is not to completely discount economic sanctions. My view is economic sanctions, particularly if Xi Jinping is thinking about whether or not he's going to roll the dice, the economic risks are significant or in a way on him. On the other hand, I think if he can kind of put a number on them and take care of them, then he's going to be able to say, okay, is this going to succeed? If he actually makes the go decision, I think economic sanctions are going to have very little effect. I mean, it's hard to find in history an example of economic sanctions really being like a decisive victory mechanism. It's almost always like the direct military fight. The sanctions and bombing and so forth can attrit the other side ability to conduct the war, but as we see with the Russians, but it's very unlikely to make them give up. And of course, the Chinese, once a conflict starts over Taiwan, that is a deeply held issue and central to the identity of not only this Communist Party in general, but Xi Jinping. So that's relying on economic sanctions is very, very unwise. The key thing that we really have to do is be able to demonstrate to them that we can ideally clearly and with very high probability, defeat the invasion. I think we've moved past the point where we can kind of very readily say that. We're now in a world where it's arguable and possibly trending in the Chinese favor. We'll see what the administration's budget requests. They're advertising that they're talking about a lot of munitions. That's encouraging. There's not a lot that we can do in the space of single-digit years because of the nature of defense procurement, the defense industrial base, and so forth. But I think this is like we got to really like crystallize the problem, and this is not about Europe and Germany having a nice saying, the European Union saying something about Taiwan. This is about whether or not American military forces with Taiwan, Japan, Australia could defeat a Chinese invasion. If Xi thinks the Chinese invasion is going to be defeated, I don't think he'll act. I mean, Mao Zedong wanted to take over Taiwan, but he never tried, really, because he knew he would fail.
Yeah, I completely agree with that assessment. I mean, it's a risk versus reward thing for Xi and the PLA at the moment. I mean, if they could take Taiwan today, they would absolutely take Taiwan today. But it would have to be a clear victory, and it has to be really quick because they can't have an extended conflict over it. I mean, for them, a 6-month conflict would be disastrous. So yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. It's a risk versus reward thing at this point.
If you allow me to kind of conclude with one very difficult question, but I'd be very interested to hear your take on it as we close out this Twitter space. In 1941 or in the 1941, right, the US and the Allies decided that they have to make common cause with the Soviet Union to defeat Nazi Germany. And then after 1945, gradually kind of they reintegrated Germany into the defense strategy to use them also as part of their counterweight to the Soviet Union. Now, I'm using these examples because the question, that's given what's currently going on, a very, very difficult question, but I want to ask it nonetheless. On the long run, do you think it might be necessary to, despite, without a doubt, the atrocities, the war crimes that have happened, kind of to bring, maybe not as an ally, but at least as a sympathizing state, if you want, to bring Russia back into the Western sphere of influence or into the Western fold? Kind of, if Velina forgives me if I borrow a term from her, kind of to break the bear out of the dragon bear, so to speak, which for good reasons I think currently seems like a horrific thought, but also what Elbridge described, right, and Albert, what you described, kind of to kind of break the potential land bridge, or one land bridge to China, whether it's then energy resources or food, so that we kind of have to, or potentially to look very cold and calculating at the long-term relationship with Russia. And as again, what everyone thinks about it, that in the past we have maybe not forgiven, but decided to overlook atrocities by states like, for example, Germany, when strategic imperatives demanded it. Again, I know it's a difficult question, but maybe both of you, kind of as a concluding remark, could give us your view on this.
I think that ship has sailed at the moment. Just the actions of the United States against the Russians and putting them in a corner has most likely solidified that, Valina's coined term, the dragon bear, for decades to come. And that's when Elbridge mentioned, Russia supplying them with food and energy and whatnot. This is the problem that the United States faces. It's like we push too hard in one area with the Russians, and now we have to live with the ramifications of China and Russia, sticking together, even through a conflict for the next, few decades, probably the next generation, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I have a somewhat different view. I mean, to be clear, I think what Putin and the Kremlin have done and are doing is evil. It's a war of aggression, and they're conducting barbarities against the Ukrainian people, as I'm sure you guys both agree. That's not the issue, or that is the issue, I should say. But and I think it's very important to kind of frame this before we start. Like, there's I would differentiate a moral foreign policy from a moralistic foreign policy. I mean, I think we have a lot of moralism in our foreign policy, like President Biden typifies in a lot of ways. He went to Kiev and gave a kind of chest-thumping speech, and he said, "I left my heart in Kiev and will always stand with democracies but autocracies." And then he comes back, and like a week later, his administration is saying, "I actually didn't mean that." So like that's not, to me, that's not, in a sense, foreign policy is like a fiduciary. It should be a steward, particularly to the in a republic. I would imagine a constitutional monarchy is the same idea, but it should be a steward to the people, right, the citizenry. And so a moral foreign policy, in my view, is one that takes the long view and says what's in our people's interest in a way that, obviously we're not committing evil or barbarous acts in the international sphere. Well, China is the biggest problem. It's the biggest threat to us all. I mean, if Americans are worried about China, Europeans should be terrified because, I mean, you're weak and fractious, right? I'm sorry, but like, if Americans, the most cohesive, the strongest country in the world for over a century, is worried about China, Europe should be petrified, right? If that's the biggest challenge, then we need to act accordingly. And I mean, you mentioned Stalin, Ralph. That's true. One of history's biggest murderers. We also made common cause with another of history's biggest murderers, Mao Zedong. Doesn't mean that we think that Mao Zedong was good or Joseph Stalin was good, but we had a priority that we needed to meet. In the case of China, we went too far. In some sense, in the case of the USSR, briefly, but in China, we went along with that system too long. But I think the point that I would say is we should look at Russia over time. We should think about Europe, of course, and a sort of fair and stable situation for Ukraine and for Europe. But we should be thinking about it through the lens of how does this relate to the competition with China? Now, that does not mean that we are just nice and get taken advantage of by Vladimir Putin again. I think we've tried that. We've tried a reset several times. And it hasn't worked. It may be that being tough on Russia in some ways could actually be more effective, and especially if we can see a future government. I mean, if you look, Khrushchev was followed by Brezhnev, which had a different policy, at least for some time. I think that's the kind of mindset that we should be taking, where at a minimum, we should be seeking to sort of detach and drive wedges between the Chinese and the Russians, because, if we accept that they're going to be a dragon bear for the foreseeable future, that's a huge, huge, I mean, that is, the largest states in Eurasia arrayed against us. That's not a good situation for us to be in. Doesn't mean that we need to become allies with the Russians, but I think we should be looking for opportunities where possible over time to drive wedges, also balancing that with our interests in Europe. I mean, when we're thinking about Russia, obviously we're thinking a lot more about Europe. When we're thinking about China, we're going to be thinking about Asia and the globe more. But I think that's the way I would recommend thinking about the Russia issue in the context of China.
All right. Well, there's much we left unsaid. I would have loved to touch on Indonesia. There would have been a lot to talk about. India, we barely mentioned Iran. I apologize for the topics we didn't get to. Elbridge, Colby, Albert, Marko, thank you so much for taking the time. Again, my apologies for making everyone wait for an hour. I think it was worth it. This was fantastic, and I'm looking forward to doing this again in the future. Thank you to everybody who tuned in and listened to. hopefully we can do this again. Have a good day, have a good night, and I hope to talk to all of you soon.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.